Okay, prehistory, legend, and history. Or what makes something historical, right? Where do we draw the line between something that is prehistory and something that is history, and in a genre sense, but also in a time sense? So the key marker between history and prehistory seems to be the presence of written texts. So that seems to be where we differentiate between what is a prehistorical culture that we can only study through its artifacts versus a historical culture that we can study through what it says about itself. From the vantage point of Western civilization, this does make some sense. There's an age so ancient that it came before writing but left traces. But then there was writing. Voila, cuneiform. And suddenly we have an understanding of a culture on its own terms through what it has to say about itself. Indeed, epics, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is pictured here, they're often the earliest histories we get in many societies. But it's worth pausing to say an epic poem is not the same thing as, say, a Thucydides-inspired objective history. So let's jump into that distinction a little bit, right? Everywhere we look in Western cultures, the beginnings of history for a location are linked to two things: empire and epic. And the whole of history is generally told. So okay, that should be period, empire and epic. And then if we take a step back and we say, we're going to tell the story of ancient and medieval cultures, we usually do that by teaching a succession of one epic empire after another. So we're going to get into that, right? This empire, and then this empire, and then this empire seems to be the way that we teach it. And linked to each of those empires is often an epic. So Gilgamesh, we'll start there. For example, is the legendary history of a king of Uruk. Probably actually lived, we're estimating, about 2100 BCE. There are documents of him as an actual king, and then of course there's an oral tradition that eventually gets copied into more permanent media, and the age at which that happens is the first Babylonian Empire. So that's literally right around the time of Hammurabi. So we're writing law codes, and we're consolidating power, and we're trying to create an identity for the people that we rule over as a collective unit. And we do this not by praising ourselves or how great we are as emperor, but we do this by saying, look, we all share this glorious past with these values, right? And then the next empire to make use of this epic is the Akkadian Empire, which actually is a substantially different culture with a different writing system and a slightly different language. And it's from higher up in Mesopotamia. So that means like upriver, but also uphill. And they have, as a result, a different social structure. I mean, not markedly different, but enough that they're a different people. And so when they come in and they take over lower Mesopotamia, that is an identity problem for the people who are living in lower Mesopotamia. And one of the ways that the Akkadian Empire sort of assuaged these differences and maintained a certain amount of peace was by recasting themselves as belonging to the same culture as this epic. Now, Uruk, that is a lower Mesopotamian city. And the Akkadians are upper Mesopotamians. And what they ingeniously do is kind of synthesize their own culture with that of lower Mesopotamia so that no one conquered feels as if they have been conquered by a foreign power. It's just a change of leadership, right? Transition of power. All right. So that's the Epic of Gilgamesh. That goes way back. But then the question of whether or not a class like this will start with Gilgamesh really depends upon how far back your instructor goes. most of the time, people will go far enough back to get to Homer. Some of the time, they'll go far enough back to get to Gilgamesh. So the question of whether or not we identify Mesopotamia and Gilgamesh as part of our tradition is really a question of where we draw the line between ours and too foreign to understand. And that could be spatially, right? It's Middle Eastern. Or it could be temporally. It's really old. There we go. We have a toddler soundtrack. So hang on. I need a second to collect my thoughts. Homer, right. So Homer's Greece. Homer is the poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And these pair of epic poems, which were originally orally composed for oral performance, which means they were probably a little bit flexible. These poems defined Greek identity. They did this through the heroes and their particular brand of heroism, right? Like what counts as admirable. But they also did this by positioning the human activity, specifically of Greeks, within the greater workings of the universe, like the gods and their quarrels. And the last thing that it does is it defines the Greeks against someone else. So that's new. The Epic of Gilgamesh doesn't do a lot of that. There are like monsters and adventures, but there isn't an other people. The events of the Trojan War probably did happen. There is certainly argument among the archaeologists as to when that was. So I'll leave it to them and just give you a big window, 13th through 11th century BCE. But the epics that Homer is composing don't come around for at least 3 centuries. At least, right? 3 to 5 centuries later. So we have to ask ourselves, same thing. We saw the same thing with, not Beowulf. That is not what I mean, but it's true of Beowulf as well. We saw the same thing with Gilgamesh, and where Gilgamesh lives in like 2100, and the earliest version of this poem is 1800, so 300 years. So there seems to be a requirement for a span of time between said hero, whether real or mythological, and the moment in which that hero gets immortalized in the form of an epic poem. And then to try and retrace how we get the form of the poem that we have, we also have to look at what we have copies of. So we estimate that this was composed sometime in 8th century BCE based upon the things that are in the poem, our understandings of certain political alliances, references to things that happened in history that we do know the date of. But there's a big gap between when that is composed and when it is written down, and we don't really know that when that happened for sure, but we do know it was at least by the 1st century CE because we have fragments of papyrus, of course, fragments of papyrus from the 1st and 2nd centuries. And in the 5th century, we have a manuscript with a complete set of pictures. That's what miniatures are, but not the text. Right? So they tell the full story, but they do it in pictorial form. The oldest copy that we have of a complete Iliad or Odyssey is from the 10th century. So that's a long time to transmit something without us having evidence of exactly what it looked like when it was originally written down, or even farther back when it was originally composed. So tracing epics and their relationship to history is tricky. Let's talk a little bit about what an epic is, because it tends to be very important to most cultures. Not all, but most cultures will have some version of an epic poem. So traditional definition is a long narrative poem, element 1, in elevated style, element 2. So it has to be not just a colloquial story that's told in your everyday language. It has to be fancy because it befits the gloriousness of the story that it tells. About characters of high position, so that's characteristic 3. And they go on adventures, but it's not like episodic. It's not a series of episodes that are unconnected. It creates a central arc for that heroic figure and their development through those episodes, right? And the last characteristic is that it is important to the history of a nation or a people, right? So that's what it is. Now, all epics, or I should say most epics, have some or all of the following epic conventions. So some big ones that you'll see in pretty much all of them. They all have a giant setting. So it'll be the whole known world, whatever that happens to be, right? It could be the whole the whole nation where the people live. It could be the whole world as they know it, or it could be the entire cosmos as they understand it. The heroes in an epic embody the ideals of the culture. Sometimes when we read epics, we are a little bit cynical, and so we don't relate to them as if they are being told straight. And I don't mean that in the like sexuality way. I mean as in like straightforward. They are what they seem to be in a sense. We have a lot of anti-heroes. We have complex figures and they have flaws. And epic heroes will have flaws, but they will still embody an ideal unironically. Like they literally are exactly who these people think are the best possible examples of humans. Now, pretty much all epics will include divine intervention in human affairs. The longer you go on, the more liberty there is with that. And then they also have some structural conventions. And these are some of the things that make them very hard to read, especially if you're not a person who spends a lot of time reading old stuff. Lots of times people will make long formal speeches. It's easy to get lost. Lots of times there are catalogs. So in the Iliad, for example, before you can go into battle, you will have an entire book listing all the weapons. Anyway, not my favorite part. The use of epithets. And epithets are stock phrases that are used to describe certain characters or actions. So, and you'll see them repeated a lot. So an example of that is white-armed Hera. I don't know why she's white-armed. I don't know what it means. But she's always called, not always, she is often called white-armed Hera or cow-eyed Hera, right? Or any succession of other names that she is given. So that's an epithet. And then there's also the use of epic similes. A simile is a comparison, right? And in a simile specifically, you use the words like or as in the English language. And I might say this timer is like a citrus fruit. I mean, that's literally how it's designed. That's a simile. Now, if I wanted to make it an epic simile, I would take 5 pages to say the same thing. And I would go really, really into depth. So that's another thing that tends to get people lost because it's not just all narrative. It's not all plot, which is what we're used to in a novel-based and a film-based society. We're used to events. But in epics, you pause to relish the lists of weapons, I guess, or the incredible similes. The Odyssey has a great description of Calypso's cave that pretty much is a vagina. It's kind of amazing. And it just pauses there to really sketch that in for you, really in detail. And that's a part of the experience, right? You get there, and if you think about it as oral culture, it makes a little bit of sense because you just have to build it in your mind, right? So those are some common epic conventions. I'm going to hit a few more that are very important, and we're going to take some time to look at them in the best known epics of the Western canon. And I'm going to do this instead of having you guys read these epics. You're welcome. But I do want you to have a sense of what they are and what they cover, because then when you turn to look at your own cultures, you'll have a better sense of what you're looking for to see if there are epics or things like epics in the cultures that you're studying. So first epic convention is the theme, which will often be in the first line. So the Iliad, if you're not familiar with the Iliad, it is a tale that takes place during the Trojan War, in which the Greeks are laying siege to Troy, and it goes on for 10 years, and they're doing this because Paris ran off with somebody's wife. Paris, Prince of Troy. He ran off with somebody's wife, a Greek person's wife, and Helen. And now the Greeks are like, well, fuck that, get an army, bring her back. So they've been fighting for 10 years over this. And the Greeks have brought a whole roster of heroic figures. They have Ajax, they have Agamemnon, they have Odysseus, lots of heroic figures. The Iliad is about Achilles. And we're going to find out right away what specifically about Achilles. Rage. Sing goddess of Achilles' rage, black and murderous, that cost the Greeks incalculable pain, pitched in countless souls of heroes into Hades dark, and left their bodies to rot as feasts for dogs and birds as Zeus' will was done. Begin with the clash between Agamemnon, the Greek warlord, and godlike Achilles. Which of the immortals set these two at each other's throats? Right? What a setup. You just start with this whole poem starts with the word rage. So you know right away what it's going to be about. And then we get a little clarification. Achilles' rage in particular. Now, the second of Homer's epics is the Odyssey, which is about the Greek hero Odysseus trying to come home from the Trojan War. And that one will start like this. Speak, memory. Oh, this one is about memory. So the last one is about rage. This one is about memory. And we're going to get to that theme through the cunning hero, the memory of the cunning hero, the wanderer, blown off course time and again after he plundered Troy's sacred heights. We're all set up. We got it. So it takes him like 10 years to get home. And a majority of all of the adventures that he's experienced are squeezed into like one book. It's his recollection. So it's an interesting structure because it's not long, because it takes you all that time and you go chronologically from this, then this, then this, then this. That's not how it works. You start here, you bounce back into a big long flashback, and then you come fast forward to the present. Very similar to modern filmic or cinematic storytelling. So what he's going to recount is he's going to speak, right? He's going to speak of all the cities he saw, the mines he grasped, the suffering deep in his heart at sea, as he struggled to survive and bring his men home, but could not save them, hard as he tried. Yeah, they all died. The fools destroyed by their own recklessness when they ate the oxen of Hyperion the sun, and that god snuffed out their day of return. So things don't go so well for his crew, but Odysseus does finally manage to make it home. The second thing that you see in both of these is the invocation of the muses. The muses are the Greek gods, depending on the period, gods or demigods, that oversee inspiration in the arts. So an epic will always open with a plea to the muses for inspiration so that this story can be told. And if you think about it in terms of performance, that is their request of the muses at each performance, that this performance will be well sung. So that's a key element. We saw it there. Sing goddess, Achilles' rage. Speak immortal one. Oh, of these things, speak immortal one, and tell the tale once more in our time. The other key thing is that all of these begin in media res, which means in the middle of things. That's literally in the middle of things. The epics, so the Trojan War takes 10 years, but the Iliad only takes place over the last one. And the Odyssey takes Odysseus 10 years to get home. But you're only seeing the last one. And the way that you get caught up on all of the things that have happened thus far is through his memory flashback, right? So this is written, as we made note of earlier, this is not written during the time of the Trojan War. It's written in the age of Archaic Greece, which is the 8th through 6th centuries BCE. That's kind of a long time, but it is starting to become the Greece that we know, that we think of when we think of ancient Greece. You have a transition from sort of early art forms of geometric figures to, this one is actually inspired by Mesopotamian art with the sideways figures in profile. And then they kind of develop a character of their own with the black figures. And then the last development of pottery and archaic Greek art is the sort of inverse, the negative space, where the pot, the clay, the red clay of the pot is unpainted in a sense, and the figures are brought out by painting everything else. This is also the development of the Greek alphabet when that happened. So the Phoenicians have already developed their own alphabet, and what's interesting about alphabets is, unlike what happens with the evolution of writing in China, you don't get logographs or symbols that stand for entire words. In an alphabetic system of writing, you get symbols that stand for sounds. So logographic languages are much more built around encapsulating entire ideas in a symbol. And alphabetic writing is written or is built around encapsulating speech. And so speech is the original pattern that gets encoded with letters, whereas in logographic languages, it's thought. So just key distinction there, early Greek alphabet. Here's what's happening also during Archaic Greece. It is maybe not a coincidence that we have this epic of great Greek glory during the rise of the Greek city-state, which is called a polis. And as these city-states consolidate power and become little mini kingdoms of their own, they start to create Greek colonies around the Mediterranean and Black Sea. And as you can see here, that actually is really widespread. And we don't talk a lot about this because we don't think of Greece as an empire really. But it's worth noticing that we get epic heroes of Greek warfare and travel at a time when Greeks are making war and traveling all over the Mediterranean. It makes some sense. So in this case, we have many states and many heroes. So when the Greeks travel to Troy to fight their war, it's worth noting that or when they travel home or attempt to, there is a hero of the story, but they are not the only heroes in the epics, right? There are other heroic figures, and that kind of gives credence to the fact that there will be other Greek city-states who maybe don't identify with Achilles or Odysseus, but they do identify with the Greek identity that they share, right? And this is the key function of Agamemnon and his role as trying to not be such a shitty leader. This is part of the issue, right? Agamemnon is kind of a jerk, which is why there's an entire poem about Achilles being mad at him. But the one thing he does manage to do is gather an entire pan-Greek army to work together against a common enemy. And I wonder if that might be a thing that needs to happen during Homer's moment. Right? It might be a subtle or not so subtle push towards increasing Greek affinity and identification during a time where the city-states and their consolidation of power creates tension, even as they do try to work together to expand their influence and settlements. So epics emerge at a particular moment in a culture's history. We're questioning that word a lot, so it's weird to just use it.